DNS is made up of zones, represented by these folders. There are two classes of zones that exist. We have a forward lookup zone and a reverse lookup zone. A forward lookup zone takes a name and resolves it to an IP address. So that's forward, name to IP. A reverse zone takes an IP address and resolves it back to a name. There are different types of zones that we can create within each of these. So I'm going to expand my forward lookup zone. And right now I have two zones that exist. One for my domain Atlantis.local, and I have another that supports the Active Directory records, this _msdcs.atlantis.local. I did not configure either one of those. Both were configured when Active Directory was installed on this server. What I can do is go to the properties of this Atlantis.local. So I'm going to right click that and go to properties. In the properties, there's a type option. So on the general tab, it says type Active Directory integrated. That's one of my zone types. If I click change, I could actually change this zone type from one to the other. So any zone can be reconfigured at any time. But I don't want to do that. I want to create a new zone. So I'm going to cancel those windows there. I'm going to right click this forward lookup zone and I'm going to choose new zone. In the new zone wizard, I'm just going to click next. Then it asks me what type of zone I want to create. Primary, secondary, stub, or this bottom one, store the zone in Active Directory. Parenthesis, it says available only if DNS server is a writable domain controller. This would be Active Directory integrated. So that's the zone type. It just does not say that in the list, but that's it. If you store an Active Directory, you have an Active Directory integrated zone. This is always the preferred zone type, Active Directory integrated. Every zone you create on a domain controller will default to be an Active Directory integrated zone. Now, if you install DNS on a server that is not a domain controller, this will not be an option. You would have to choose primary, secondary, or stub would be the only options. This would actually be grayed out on your non-domain controller. But I'm going to leave this as Active Directory integrated right now, and I want to click next. For Active Directory integrated, it says, well, who do you want this to replicate to? All DNS servers on domain controllers in the domain. I can also have it replicate throughout the entire forest, Atlantis.local. The option below, we're not concerned with that. To all domain controllers in this domain for Windows 2000 compatibility, well, we're not using Windows 2000, so that's not relevant. And I'm going to click next for that. Now it asks for the name of the zone. Well, I'm going to name this RTS.local. The option I have here for dynamic updates says allow only secure dynamic updates, recommended for Active Directory. Allow both non-secure and secure dynamic updates, or do not allow. Well, what a dynamic update means, when your computer connects to the network, it pulls an IP address from DHCP, or you have a static IP address. But either way, you register with your preferred DNS server. A secure-only dynamic update means DNS will only register you and only create a record for you if you are a member of the domain. If you're a visitor and your machine's in a workgroup, it will not create a record for you. You can still resolve names on the internet, so you still have access to resources, but it won't clutter the DNS database by creating a record for you. I could say allow both, non-secure and secure. Now, to me, this could have been worded much better by Microsoft. But non-secure update simply means you are not a member of the domain. You're in a workgroup or you are in another domain. This would create the record regardless of your domain membership. Or do not allow. That would imply you do not have DHCP. Someone would have to go to DNS and manually create every single record by hand. If the IP address on that device changes, you then have to go to DNS and enter the new address. So really not compatible with DHCP, and unlikely we set that. The default for our Active Directory integrated zone is allow only secure dynamic updates. So I'm going to click next for that and finish, and my zone exists. The big characteristic of an Active Directory integrated zone is the fact that it replicates with Active Directory and it resides on all of your domain controllers. And on any domain controller, I have the ability to completely manage all the records. So I can create, delete records from any domain controller, and it simply replicates that deletion. When you install Active Directory, DNS will be configured, and the type of zone that's defined by default is always an Active Directory integrated zone. So that's our look at an Active Directory integrated zone. the preferred zone type. Now, to look at the others, which are a little less common, I'm going to go back to my rts.local. I'm going to right-click that and go to Properties. On the type where it says Active Directory Integrated, I'm going to click Change, and I'm going to deselect Store the Zone in Active Directory, available only if you're a domain controller. Well, when I deselect that, this is no longer an Active Directory Integrated zone. Now it's a primary zone. So I'm going to click OK for that. It says, do you want this zone to be no longer Active Directory Integrated? That's what we want to do. So I'm going to say yes. Notice it now says Type Primary. It no longer replicates with Active Directory. We know that because this replication is grayed out and you can't configure it. Also notice dynamic updates. Secure only is not an option. So your only two choices are no dynamic updates. And again, you really can't use DHCP internal if that's what you want to do. Or you have to choose non-secure and secure, which basically that's all. It can't verify your membership in the domain. It just says anybody that wants to register, any device. That would include iPhones, Androids, any device. It's going to create a record for you. So your DNS could get cluttered if you have guest or visiting devices on the network. Well, I'm going to go ahead and apply that, and that's a primary zone. One primary zone does not talk to another primary zone. So if I have multiple locations, if I put primary zones in each of my locations, they would never communicate with each other. Records in one would never carry over to the other. So what we'll do is create one primary zone. In my other locations, I'm going to create a secondary zone. A secondary zone is simply a read-only copy of a primary zone. Well, I'm going to click OK on this screen here. Now this is a primary zone, rts.local. I'm going to create a new host record in it. So I'm going to go to new host A, and I'm going to name this Sales PC01, and I'm going to give it an IP address 172.16.0.100. So I have a valid IP address for that record, and I'm going to click Add Host. I'm going to click OK for that, and done. So now I have a primary zone that has a handful of records in it. Only one primary we can have though. The other zone type I need to create is a secondary zone. I want this primary zone to transfer itself to a secondary. To make that happen, it's a few configurations you have to be aware of. I'm going to right click this rts.local primary zone it is now. So I'm going to go to the properties of it. There is a Zone Transfers tab in the Properties. On the Zone Transfers tab, the first thing I have to do is click Allow Zone Transfer. This gives you three basic options. To any server, you would never do that on a production network because you would literally transfer this to any server that sent a request to you. That would be a security violation. The other option, only to servers listed on the Name Servers tab. Well, there's a Name Servers tab here. This would give you a list of all the machines that you are willing to transfer to. I could click Add and type in any name of any machine that I want to transfer to, and it would be allowed to transfer. You still have to configure it. This simply says allow the zone to transfer to that machine. Back on the Zone Transfers tab, the last option is only to the following servers. I can edit and type in the IP address of a server. Well, I'm going to type in the address 172.16.0.11. That's one of my DNS servers. Now, it'll take a moment, but that'll eventually turn to a green check. So I'm going to say OK for that. And we'll actually transfer this and verify it works. So right now, this will only transfer to servers with the IP address 172.16.0.11. I'm going to click Apply for that. The other thing that shows up here is this Start of Authority. This is what governs your transfer. So by default, the refresh interval here is how often you transfer, like what frequency. Every 15 minutes, the secondary comes to the primary and pulls down changes. So we could say that these servers are never more than 15 minutes out of sync with each other. 15 minutes, secondary comes to the primary to see what's new. If for some reason that fails, there's a retry interval. Every 10 minutes, the secondary would come back if the refresh failed. So that retry is always some value less than the refresh interval. And you can set this to whatever you believe is appropriate. It could go from seconds to days, whatever you believe is appropriate for your specific situation. Well, if this fails, the refresh fails at 15 minutes, we enter the retry. Well, let's say that fails every 10 minutes. After 24 hours of trying, an entire day, this secondary zone is simply going to say, well, I'm not resolving any names. I'm expired. I can't guarantee the records I have are accurate because I have not talked to the primary and I have not transferred anything down. So expires after 1 day by default. Well, I'm going to click OK for that. All that's fine there. Zone transfers, they're enabled. Now I'm going to switch to serve 1. So this is my, as you'll see at the top, RTS serve 1. I'm going to open DNS on this server, and DNS is going to be blank on this server. So I'll click on the server, forward lookup zone. I have no zones on this server whatsoever. So what I'm going to do, right click, new zone. I'm going to click next, and it says, well, what type of zone do you want? Primary, secondary, stub. Notice store the zone in Active Directory is grayed out. This machine, my RTS-serve1, is not a domain controller, could never host an Active Directory integrated zone. So I'm going to click secondary for that, and next. The names have to be the same. My zone that I created was named rts.local. I'm going to type rts.local. So the name of the zone you want to transfer has to be the same. The reason it has to be is because a DNS server can have an unlimited number of zones on it. This is what says I want to transfer this one specific zone. So I'm going to click next for that. Now it says, what's the IP address of the master server? For me, that is 172.16.0.10. So I'm going to just click that and next and finish. Now, if you're doing this in your own environment, when you click on this, it's going to say zone not loaded. You have to wait a few minutes, then click refresh. It may still say not loaded. I'm impatient, so I don't want to wait too long. Well, now it's working. So now on my RTS serve 1, I have a copy of those records. What's different though, if I right click sales PC, I can't delete it. I can't do anything to it. If I look at the properties, everything's grayed out because a secondary, as we said earlier, is a read-only copy of a zone. If I right click the zone, all I can do is transfer from master. I can't create a host record or anything like that. And if I go to the properties of the zone, it just says type is secondary. So if you had a parent office, you could have a primary. A branch office, you could deploy a read-only secondary. The benefit to that, your users now can query a local server in their location. They don't have to cross a WAN link, but the local server is read-only. So you really don't manage it. You don't do anything to it other than the initial configuration. Now that start of authority we talked about says every 15 minutes, this machine is going to go to the primary and pull down changes. So effectively, it's a distribution point. With that said, the zone type we prefer to use, though, is Active Directory integrated. It is far more efficient because it replicates with Active Directory and takes a lot of the characteristics of Active Directory. You would only think about a secondary zone. If you are going to deploy DNS on machines that are not domain controllers, this would be a possibility. This used to be very common long ago, but now Active Directory integrated zones are the standard for several reasons. Well, I'm going to just click OK on that. That is done. So I have my secondary zone. The last zone type we have is a stub zone. So I'm going to switch back to my domain controller. I'm going to right-click rts.local again and go to properties. Now we made this a primary zone a moment ago. If I click change, stub is in the list. Now under stub, it says this is the copy of a zone containing only name server records. That's the NS. Name server records are records for DNS servers. So if you install DNS on a machine, it automatically creates a name server record for itself. So it denotes you're a DNS server. So it has the name server record for a DNS server. It has the start of authority, the SOA. We looked at that. That has the refresh interval, the retry interval, the expiration on it. And it says possibly a glue A record. What a glue A record actually is a host A record for a DNS server. Let's say you have 3 DNS servers. You create a stub zone for a zone that has 3 DNS servers. That stub zone is going to have one start of authority, specifies, refresh, retry, and all that stuff. But it's going to have 3 NS records and 3 of these A records. 1 NS record for each DNS server and a host A record for each DNS server. So 3 DNS servers, you'd have 3 NS and 3 A records. That's it. Does not have records for clients or anything like that. The only common implementation for the stub zone here is within the same forest. If I'm in a child domain and I want to resolve names in a parent domain, I don't want to create a secondary zone because I don't want all those records pulled down to me. I may not want to use Active Directory integrated zones because that would then replicate all the records from the parent domain to the DNS server in my domain. I just want to be able to resolve names in the parent domain. The most efficient way to do that would be to create a stub zone. A stub zone is no different than a secondary when you create it. You just define, say, primary or Active Directory integrated on your one server here. When you go to the other server, the way we created secondary, you simply click stub. Now, to look at that for good measure, I'm going to switch back to the other server. So I'll cancel this, and I'm going to leave this as a primary. Back on RTS serve 1, I'm going to delete that zone. So I'm going to say yes for that. And I'm going to create another forward lookup zone. So new zone. This time, I'm going to choose stub. And it asks the same questions. What is the name? rts.local. It says it's going to create a file, rts.local.dns. I'm going to say next for that. And it says, what's the IP address? 172.16.0.10. That's good. So I'm going to say next for that and finish. Now I have a stub zone. Notice the record for sales PC is not in it because that's not a domain controller. It's not a DNS server. It's not anything. So I only get my NS records and the start of authority records. If I had other DNS servers, I would get the NS records and the A records for those as well. So just name server records. All the records required to identify you as a DNS are the only thing that shows up in a stub zone. I don't need the zone on this RTS serve 1 anymore, so I'm going to right click that and just delete it. And that zone will disappear. If I switch back to my domain controller again, back on RTS DC1, the domain controller, if I click OK on that, I have that zone. So what we've done is take that Active Directory integrated zone, convert it to a primary, then we created a secondary on another server and then a stub on another server. The thing to keep in mind about zones is the fact that a zone is nothing more than a folder. A folder that contains all the records that resolve name to IP and IP to name if we look at a reverse lookup zone. In the next lesson, we're going to actually look at the reverse lookup zone.